Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave. I am Mario P. This is episode 34, Universities in the Climate Crisis with Aaron Thierry. In the allegory of the cave, Plato refers several times to something which could be akin to what we understand by integrity. If you're in a university or academic institution, chances are that you've done some courses on research integrity and scientific integrity. But what is integrity at its core? So, when the prisoner goes up, when they are released from the chains and they go upwards, Plato emphasizes that they don't just have to turn their head, but their entire body. So it's not just a matter of having the right knowledge, but everything else has to be congruent with it as well. Emotions, the physical experience of it, everything. And later, when the prisoner returns back into the cave, Plato writes that they see the judges speaking about justice without ever having seen the idea of justice itself. So they're using words and concepts like justice, but it doesn't refer to what Plato, I guess, would call the essence of justice. So now that we are in a climate crisis, I mean, if you are one of those people who listens to science, what does integrity mean for a university and for an academic at the university? Our guest today is examining the role of scientists in the climate crisis and the relation between science and activism. He was one of the authors on a paper by Capstick, Thierry, Cox, Berglund, Westlake and Steinberger, published in 2022 in Nature with the title Civil Disobedience by Scientists Helps Press for Urgent Climate Action. So I'll read you two quotes from this paper. This is the first one. The credibility of scientists is influenced by whether they are seen to be acting in line with shared values and promoting the well-being of others, and in the context of climate change, according to whether their actions clearly align with their message. In other words, whether they walk the talk. This is the other quote. Civil disobedience by scientists has the potential to cut through the myriad complexities and confusion surrounding the climate crisis in a way that less visible and dispassionate evidence provision does not, sending a clear signal that scientists believe strongly in the evidence and its implications. When those with expertise and knowledge are willing to convey their concerns in a more uncompromising manner than through papers and presentations, this affords them particular effectiveness as a communicative act. This is the insight of Greta Thunberg when she calls on us to act as you would in a crisis. Aaron Thierry has a background as an ecological scientist, science communicator and environmental campaigner. He received his original PhD in ecology from the University of Sheffield and went on to a position as a postdoc on a project researching climate feedbacks in the Arctic. He then left academia to focus his efforts on environmental activism and become a youth campaign coach working for a leading UK environmental charity. His past experiences have led him to become fascinated by the question of how to accurately convey scientific warnings of environmental risk in ways that help wake the public to action. To better understand this crucial conundrum, he has chosen to return to research and began a new PhD examining the interplay between reason and emotion in the communication strategies of organizations in the climate emergency movement. So, Aaron, could you start by telling us a little bit about this new PhD that you're doing?
I'm in a slightly funny position because I'm actually done a PhD about 10 years ago in ecology, and that was a kind of natural sciences PhD at the time, and I'd kind of previous to that done a bachelor's in zoology, and that was kind of very much the path that I'd been on. So I'm actually doing another one, having never thought I'd ever do any further study again of that sort. And I've gone back to university, but I'm studying as a social scientist now. So my degree is in sociology, and I'm looking at the sociology of science and how scientists interface with society. The way in which scientific knowledge is used in society, and in particular, I'm interested in the role that scientists are playing in the climate movement. And so trying to understand the ways in which scientists use their knowledge, but also their authority in order to argue for particular goals or ends or policy objectives.
Yeah, in the last conversation, I guess it's now 2 episodes ago with Ernst Jan Kuiper, I spoke to him just the day after he was in a climate protest, and he didn't do it personally, but there were also scientists there that stuck their research papers to police vehicles. How do you look at that?
Yes, no, absolutely. So I'm, again, slightly funny in my position because I'm coming at this as kind of doing research from a position of a scientist who's also taking part in some of these kinds of protests. So, I'm interested in it because I've been doing it and I'm trying to understand what it means. and
So you are also you're a climate activist? Would you describe yourself as that? Yeah.
So very much so. So like I said, so my background is in natural sciences, and I was using that research, working on that research that took me to study climate cycle feedbacks in the Arctic, trying to understand how permafrost thaw and so on is accelerating carbon emissions from those environments and accelerating global warming. So, my experiences in those places really alarmed me. I was, quite, deeply concerned by what I've learned about the scale of the climate and ecological crisis.
When was this?
This was well, it's over the last decade. So
yeah.
I was doing that research in between 2008 and 2016 or so.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of lots of different things, I guess, led to me at some point just saying I didn't want to continue studying the scale of the problem. I didn't want to carry on describing all of these impacts and feeling that it wasn't going to actually then lead to social change. And so I'd kind of gone in pretty naively, I think, with a view that, to be a scientist is to produce knowledge that is then useful to society, that people can then act on that knowledge and make better decisions. And so I kind of had this kind of quite a simple kind of model of kind of which we typically talk about as kind of like an information deficit model, that we just didn't know enough, or if we did know it, we just needed to communicate it more.
Yeah, the public is not informed enough, and we need to inform them of the facts, and then they will act on them, or the public, the politicians as well, right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. So I spent quite a lot of time trying to meet with politicians and give them briefing documents and so on. But at some point, it became kind of clear that, again, it wasn't the lack of knowledge that was holding us back, and it wasn't the lack of efforts to teach and to share that knowledge. I mean, there's been report after report that's been produced, but we're still not seeing the actions that are commensurate to that in society. There's been promises made, but then they're never followed through, and so on. And one of the things that's really became clear to me doing that was the way in which we were up against very powerful vested interests who were very effective at sowing doubt about science in the public discourse through propaganda and PR efforts. There was a lot of that as well within our own institution. So I was involved in supporting students on a campaign to try and get the university to divest from fossil fuels, and just seeing the institutional resistance to change that happened at every single step of that process really kind of made me realize just how important campaigning is as a way of trying to produce change, but also that it's not simply enough to produce knowledge and to give the facts, or even to try and have even just to win the argument. You can win the argument and still nothing happen.
So you would present the evidence maybe about fossil fuels and the impact and the need to slow this down or stop new projects and present your arguments, right?
Yeah. And the arguments would normally be accepted.
Yeah.
On surface, they would say, yes, this is, we accept that, and then nothing would change, right? So there was a kind of a disconnect, and it was that kind of really fascinated me as well, this kind of notion of this disconnect. So, but I also saw that change was possible, and I saw that these students ultimately won their campaign, because they occupied the finance office, right, and caused a huge fuss. It was in the national media. There was loads of attention brought down on the university, and the university caved to that pressure. It wasn't a rational process, but we were here in an institutional setting that was premised on the idea that knowledge and reason and argument was the way to do things. So kind of it was a real wake up call for me that's how things change really, and it's not really reassuring that that's the way things are, but I think you can definitely learn from that.
So, and then because you're a scientist, you want to study the role of activism scientifically.
Maybe that's right. I mean, I definitely like learning, and I like studying, and I like being part of the academy and all of the kind of the freedom that of thought and so on that gives you. But I think for me, I want to better understand why some scientists are now taking these actions. Why others aren't, and also what does it mean for science and how the public perceives science? Maybe does it affect the integrity of the scientific enterprise, as it were? What's it mean for the social contract that some people say exists between science and society? So those are the kind of questions that I'm kind of grappling at the moment with my PhD.
I recently wrote an opinion piece, but it's in Dutch, about the question that people were asking, because there were some scientist rebellion people taking part in a protest against private jets in Eindhoven airport, but they were also like Ernst Young, part of the Extinction Rebellion blockade of the A12, and there's going to be another one at the end of May. So I wrote something about that. The question that people ask is, should scientists take part in this? So you can say, should, in the sense of, are scientists allowed to take part in this? You can ask, should they take part of this as a scientist?
Yeah.
But you can also say, should you take part in this? Like, as a scientist, should you make sure that you have research integrity? Yes, you should.
Yeah. I mean, I've thought about this a lot, and I was actually an author on a paper not too long ago where we argued that scientists are justified in taking part in civil disobedience. So we set out a series of reasons why we thought that was the case. We didn't necessarily say they should do. I think that's a matter of personal conscience.
Yeah.
But what we were arguing is that there are reasons that it would be a sensible thing to consider to do at this point. And so that really boils down to the fact that we are in an emergency, as far as I can see it, right? Like we are in a crisis. It's widely recognized as such. In the UK, the Parliament has declared a climate emergency officially, and so has many of the UK universities as well, right? They've officially declared that. So we recognize that we're in a very serious, urgent situation. We also recognize quite often that not enough is being done.
Yeah.
But we've tried lots of other ways of trying to push for change, right? We've tried petitioning, we've tried writing letters, we've tried lobbying, we've tried producing knowledge and research and giving talks. We've tried so many ways to try and push for more action, and none of them have really led to the scale of change that we need. The social inertia is still very great, and so we have to then think about, okay, what can we do more that could help break through that and lead to more rapid change? And I think looking at past social transformations, civil disobedience has always been a key part of those transformations. We can look at in the UK to the women's suffrage movement, or in the US to the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and so on. We can look at these examples in history and see that when really dramatic changes in society have been brought about by people breaking the law peacefully with good conscience, to draw attention to their cause, right? And I think, therefore, we know, at least historically, that this can seemingly lead to change. So then the question, I think, becomes, well, why should scientists particularly consider doing that? Is that their place? Is that their role? And I think for several reasons, I think it is. So one, it's effective potentially. So therefore, we should think about doing it. But then it's also, it's ethical because there is so much at stake, right? There's so much harm that there could be happen as a result of the climate crisis not being addressed. It's harm that we know about more than perhaps most others as scientists who've studied this. And therefore, I think we do have a kind of a sense of um, responsibility that might come with that to say that we should act on what we know to try and prevent that harm. And civil disobedience, I think, can be really communicatively effective because, what you're doing is you're taking a stand and you're speaking out very, very publicly, and you're doing so in a way that is almost sacrificial. You're taking a consequence often for your actions. And that's a message then. You're signifying that this is so important to you and your sense of yourself and what's important, that you're willing to, take on consequences in order to try and push for change on that issue. And that's a message that you're sending to everybody else. And as scientists are very well trusted and respected members of society who are recognized as experts on these topics, when they do that, I think it carries extra communicative weight. And then I think finally, I think one of the reasons that I think it's important that we carry out civil disobedience is because it's very revealing of the kind of systemic barriers to change. It makes the invisible visible. And just by way of trying to explain that, well, one of the things that you often find is, as people are taking part in these protests, it then forces a dilemma onto the governments. Does the state react and try to repress the protests, or does it respond to the protests? And quite often it reacts to stop them, to try and protect the status quo. And by doing so, it starts to become quite clear whose side the government is on. So in this case, we're say this, the stuff that Ernst has been doing in the Hollands, where they're making a very reasonable demand to stop fossil fuel subsidies, which has been promised by the governments already. And yet, when they make that demand, what does the government do? It puts out water cannons to try and clear them off the roads. So the government is so entrenched in its support for the existing status quo that it's willing to spray scientists with water cannons in order to stop them making that point. And so that's a really strong message then to the public. What's going on here? The government is in bed with fossil fuel interests, and that's then revealing to the public the situation in a very visceral, vivid kind of way.
Yeah, and politicians in the Netherlands, some of them are calling for a stronger disciplining of the peaceful protesters. So, yeah. Do you have hope that we will face this crisis?
So there's lots of ways I could try and answer that question. I think it's important to point out that I don't think you have to be optimistic or pessimistic in order to take action about this, right? So I don't want to be prescriptive to say that others have to feel a certain way. I think people need to make up their own minds and act. But for myself, I think it can depend on the day of the week, partly, actually. But no, I think a lot of the time I don't feel very hopeful. I mean, I think we are up against huge odds, and that's partly the reason that we have failed to succeed so far. I mean, I think we're up against some very, very powerful forces, and so it feels like a David versus Goliath battle to me a lot of the time. But David won his battle against Goliath, right? So I think for me, hope is a very slippery concept, and it's quite a dangerous concept at times. I think hope can lead to inaction. I think hope can be seductive and placating, where people just hope that things are going to be okay.
That someone else will fix it, or that, of course, it can result in technological solutionism, that you think, well, someone will invent something that will take care of the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, it's magical thinking.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point.
And I think, so for me, that kind of hope is something we should try to avoid. Obviously, there are going to be technologies that become available that we don't currently have, and so on, and that's all good, and people should work to try and make them, but they won't just happen on their own, right? And I think this is the thing about all of this, is that what we need is activity, right? We need action, we need agency, and for me, that's what produces hope. So the more people that are active, the more hopeful I can be, and so that's how I normally think about these things. And I, there's the famous quote by Gramsci about pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. And this notion that, it's actually, no matter what, how bad you think things look, you keep going in the hope to try and make them better. And I think for me, when it really boils down to it, I'm not doing this because I think it's from a kind of a consequentialist framework of, I think I've weighed up the costs and benefits and I'm taking these actions because I think this is going to be the most likely to succeed. It's more that I'm operating, I think, from a slightly more of a virtue ethics kind of framework, where my sense of what is right and wrong is so violated by what is currently happening and the way in which governments are carrying on and just allowing the destruction of the things that I care about so much in the world, that I'm going to try and resist that. I'm going to try and stand up for what I believe is right and good and stuff in the world. And so for me, it's that's motivating me. It's that feeling of outrage and injustice. It's the feeling of, standing up for my convictions and what it means to hold on to my integrity. That's what gets me up in the morning to go out and do this thing again and again. Much more than any kind of particular sense that I'm going to succeed, or I know that we're going to win, or anything like that.
And do you look at that from, sometimes I think about, because for me it's easy because I have a 5-year-old daughter. Then I think, oh yeah, but when she's my age, I want her to have at least the same privileges and stability that I have. So that's something that really and then you can say, well, but who am I? I'm so small. What can I do? It's all doomed anyway. Okay, but if she looks back at me, I want her to remember me that at least I did what I could.
Yes, absolutely.
Is that kind of how you look at it, or where do you get? I guess we need a grounding, or we need, maybe it's not, hope is not the right word, but like maybe a vision or something, a driving force. Maybe is that a better way?
I think a vision is helpful. I definitely, I think so. It's the gap between what the world is that you want it to be, and where it is headed, right? And it's trying to close that gap. It's trying to realign things with the vision that you want to see, right? Those values that you hold deep inside of you coming to fruition, and actually what the world would look like if those values were properly enacted, right? So that's the gap that you're trying to close. So yes, the vision, I think, is helpful.
What about Plato's cave? How do you read that?
So yes,
I like asking. It's such a broad question. You could say anything, right?
Yeah,
and,
I think I could.
How are you going to come at it? That's what I like about doing this podcast.
So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't claim to know anything particularly insightful about Plato's cave, but
that's the people I want to speak to. I'm not speaking on general. I'm not speaking to Plato experts on this podcast. I'm speaking to the people who, because it's like a story anyone can read. You can get the gist of it very quickly, or you can dive very deep into it. But
yeah. I mean, I think for me, one of the most striking things is this notion that the reality that people live within is what they've grown up with, right? Like that's a really powerful message from that. And also that it doesn't necessarily have to bear correspondence to an external reality potentially, right? Or at least it can be weakly connected, right? So I think that's quite an interesting thing to think about, is the way, like, how do we get our ideas, right? Well, we're all socialized into most of the things that we know, right? We're very, a lot of them, especially the more technical aspects. We go to school, we spend a lot of time there learning about the way the world should work and the way the world does work and why it works that way. and we're then given certain points of view, ideologies, certain facts that become common sense. Certain ways of seeing the world are kind of cultured within us in those situations, right? And it's not just in the learning environment. We do it in all our social interactions. And it's why we have differences between different nations and different cultures and so on. Depending on where you're born, it will determine the religious faith that you might have, the ways in which you what times you go to bed. All of these things will be dependent on the kind of ways in which you've been brought up and the culture around you, right? So the language that you speak, whether or not so why is that important? I think it's important because what we're finding is that the story or the narrative or the framework, the paradigm, that culture that most people are living within doesn't seem to make room for one, the climate and ecological crisis, and two, what it would look like to live sustainably, right? The logics of the culture that we currently live in are not set up in ways that actually facilitate that. And so, the enculturation that we go through is constantly setting us up to keep recapitulating and recreating the destructive behaviors that are leading us down this path to destruction, to our own destruction. And there's something very bizarre. I mean, it's absurd, really, when you if you take that view of it, if you're feeling like you're on the outside looking in on it like that, then somehow, I mean, we can talk about that in a second. But if you take that view, then everything starts to look surreal. It looks strange.
Yeah, absurd.
No behavior makes sense, right? And it's a little bit like the in the example, the philosopher looking at the prisoners, and the fact that they're just stuck there, not trying to get away, and just happily sat there. That seems like that's the situation that I feel most of people are in most of the time, right? Like people are going about their daily life completely as though the climate crisis is not bearing down on us. Why is it that they can do that? But I would just say I acknowledge that I'm coming at this as someone who's claiming a certain expertise and a certain point of view, and obviously that makes me feel important about my own position and so on, right? Which is not a very we should, I think, should raise some self-reflection on that position as well.
Because there might be people stuck in the cave that see shadows and they think they have the solution to everything. And I'm working on a book about this as well. And there I'm also speaking about it's tempting to see yourself as the suffering hero but no one will listen to me.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's what dictators think as well, right?
Yeah.
So that's a good note that you put in there, that we always have to be critical of ourselves. I think that's also part of the scientific attitude, right?
Yeah. I mean, but even within science, right? I think this is really important as well, that people have an understanding of that, which is most of science is built on trust, right? Like trust is absolutely key to how science works.
Yeah.
As somebody who's a specialist in a particular area of science, I have to take it for granted that all the other scientists are going about acting truthfully and honestly and pursuing their work with good intention.
Right.
Acting to seek out the truth as best they can, and not lying about their research, not fabricating their results and so on, and so that I can then build on that knowledge reliably, right? And this notion that what we're trying to do is we try and build consensus around certain facts, which we can then stabilize as a kind of a bit of knowledge that we can then use in other situations. So society then has to trust scientists that that's what they've done and that they've fulfilled that role as well. Yeah. So trust is kind of completely no one's going out there to kind of recreate every single experiment that scientists say has been done. They can't. They haven't got the skills, the resources to do that. So we just have to take them at their word, and that's a difficult thing for a lot of people to do when you're asking for really big changes to be taken on those grounds, right? We're saying we need you to believe our computer models when they tell us that we are headed to this very dangerous situation unless we stop doing all the things we normally do. It's a difficult thing to try and convince people of.
And it makes it very vulnerable to people say, yeah, but you see, it's all based on models. It's all based on trust. Yeah, and we talked about this before with Lee McIntyre about one of the most effective strategies of science deniers is to create unrealistic expectations of science.
Yep.
And another one is to denigrate. Is that my English is not very good today, but denigrate real experts. And so you just show two people on TV, yep, and they both wear white coats. So how does the audience know? And it creates a situation where it seems like it's at least 50-50, whether the evidence is out.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly that. And I think that's why one of the things that's really hard actually is helping build this vision that you were talking about. And I think, there's the other part of Plato's Cave is trying to lead the prisoners out of the cave and how difficult it is to persuade them to give up what they're familiar with and to trust the outsider, that actually it's better outside and it's safer outside and they should come with him, because on what grounds can you build that trust to believe them? So I think that's really important. The other thing it makes us aware of, as you were just alluding to, was the way in which our worlds are constantly being manipulated, right? As well. So where do we get our information from? Where do we get our sense of reality from? Who do we turn to get that information from? If a lot of those sources are actually polluted with disinformation, then that can mean, again, society does not have a good understanding of the situation that we're in, and deliberately so, right? It's not just by accident. It's because there are nefarious forces, vested interests, who are trying to prevent certain things being known and certain actions being taken. And there's a famous quote that was leaked from George Bush Jr.'s administration, where, one of his spin doctors' memos had been leaked, and it basically said, should the public come to believe that the science is settled, then they will want to see action. So we have to continue to make scientific uncertainty and doubt a central feature of the debate. But by artifice, right? They've got to manufacture that doubt. And it's the same kind of techniques that the tobacco industry, PR companies and so on did around the link between smoking and lung cancer, okay? And so we know that there's this playbook that they use to try and confuse the public and to slow down action, and it's very successful. I mean, in the UK, we have a whole suite of newspapers that constantly are publishing outright lies and nonsense, in my view, as a scientist, about what the research is saying, in order to try and persuade their readership that we shouldn't take actions, And so, again, I see them as really culpable in the crisis that we're in. These organizations, which should be, I think, informing the public, are actually misinforming the public. And that's a real problem and a barrier to action.
But how do you explain, because we can have clemency for, let's say, the last 10, 20, 30 years or something. But now, so there's a disinformation playbook, but this playbook is out there. So just not so long ago, there was another article about ExxonMobil. I saw somewhere on your Twitter timeline the climate delay bingo. So you can just listen to a politician, and there's a bingo card, and you can hear, but China should act first. If we do this, the economy is going to collapse, and all that stuff.
There's all these talking points that they just keep using. I think, one of the things is that the types of disinformation have become more sophisticated, and they've changed a little bit, right? So in the past, you kind of would see outright denial of scientific warnings, right? They would say, you can't trust scientists, the world's not getting warmer, it's getting cooler. You just deny that entirely. That's not happening anymore. Then they kind of would deny for a while that, it was humans that were responsible. They would say, no, it's the sun or it's other things. It's not us. It's not our fossil fuels. Now it's become, okay, well, it is our fossil fuels, but we shouldn't take action too fast. We should, go more slowly. We shouldn't disrupt the economy, blah, blah, blah. Every single time, every single step of the way, they're trying to slow down action. They're trying to delay action. so that they can continue digging up more fossil fuels and getting stupidly rich doing so, right? So it's a small group of people who benefit from the system as it is now, and they're acting completely at the expense of everybody else. And again, for me, that's just so unjust that they can do that and that they would do that. That it feels like we have to challenge them. We have to try and push back.
But the thing I keep coming back to is that okay. Yes, we understand that. So that's just I really like what you said about studying the problem. But at one point we have a pretty accurate diagnosis. But you and we work in academic institutions, and I don't know what kind of conversations you have been having. But let's put it another way: you would expect that of all people, the scientists and the academics that are working in institutions that are always advertising like, we stand for science the most important thing, we have to act evidence-based.
Yeah.
But they're not. I mean, they're denying, they're acknowledging a lot of part of it. But the what about China? Is it really better to eat a vegetarian than a meat burger? Because or avocados also come from South America. All those, I mean, those are the kinds of conversations that I've been having and that people have been having around me. And I see like you're having this conversation. Let's say I've spoken to you or I've spoken to Ernst Jan, saying the sea level is going to rise 7 meters if we're not careful.
Yeah.
And then you're having a conversation with someone about where you present the evidence of how a vegetarian diet compares to a meat diet and what impact it would have if an organization of thousands of employees would have standard vegetarian diet. And they're saying, yeah, but I like meat, so we're not going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's the other podcast that I listened to where you'd interviewed Chris as well.
Yeah.
And he was talking about the way in which these arguments are rationally coded, but actually they're deeply emotional arguments, right? They're deeply psychological on many different layers about, actually, no, I don't want to give this thing that I value up. So I'm going to kind of create all of these arguments as to why I need to be able to keep that thing, right? And so there's this idea of we have motivated reasoning, right? That kicks in. And that can be very true for people in academia as well, and I'm sure we do it. I do it as well. But where we try and scrutinize arguments that we don't like much more than the ones that seem to fit with our pre-existing worldview and assumptions and values, right? And so we're much more critical when it comes to things that we just seemingly feel like don't align with what we agree with already. And that's a way of then reassuring ourselves that you found flaws in that line of argument and therefore you can dismiss it, whereas you don't necessarily apply the same scrutiny to the lines of argument that support your position, right? And so that's one way in which that can happen. There's also kind of, I mean, I think this gets so big so quickly, and there's so many ways you could take this as well, but one way I think is really important to try and think about this is what we've been talking about already, which are the kind of the logics of everyday life, and trying to appear normal, trying to appear proper, trying to appear reasonable.
Social role and your social face, yeah.
Exactly that. And so, what is the appropriate role for a student or for a member of staff in a university? What does their daily life look like?
Yeah.
What's their in a lecture theatre or when they're at a research conference, what would be a normal way of operating in those conditions? And those social norms can be really powerful, right? So that to try and speak out or to challenge something that's been done maybe for a really long time is traditional, that can be actually very hard to break out of. And I think, again, that's why you tend to see people having to deliberately break conventions. And often that's a lot easier to do in groups than on your own, which is why civil disobedience is a kind of a disobedience. It's a way of kind of breaking a social norm, or a law.
But the social norm also means that if you're employee of an organization, breaking a social norm that is supported by those higher up is also kind of can be jeopardizing your career or jeopardizing your job.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, again, why doing it on your own can be more risky than if you were to maybe do that as a part of a bigger group, right? So why we should try and, organize petitions to put to management, or to organize a public town hall meeting, or to organize a rally, where you can be in larger numbers. But I think what we then have to recognize is, as well as I think what Chris was saying, is there is a psychological toll that just comes from knowing this, right? And the feelings of anxiety and grief that kind of come up when we feel helpless in the face of this crisis. And you were talking about that yourself earlier.
Yeah.
And so for a lot of people, we switch into modes of of disavowal. This notion that on the one hand, we know it rationally or intellectually, but we then bury that or hide that from ourselves so that we can just continue with normal daily routine. Because to have that awareness conscious all the time becomes too overwhelming, right? So there's a kind of a splitting that we can do to kind of separate those things. And I think, again, scientists who work in this field often have to do that just in order to keep going back to do their work every day, right? So we kind of get quite good at it. And I think a lot of people get stuck in that kind of mode where, and again, there's the social rule, the norm around being a scientist. What is to be a good scientist is to be unemotional, right? It's to be purely rational.
Purely rational, yeah.
And that means that we maintain that disconnect between what we know and what we feel. And it's only when those two things really come together that we start to see action, right? There's a famous quote by, I think it was a Chinese philosopher, that said, to know and not to act is not to know. And I think that's a state that a lot of us are in, right? And again, I'm not saying that's purely individual. I think this is a social phenomenon. There's a social sociologist, social anthropologist called Carrie Norgard, who's written a book called Living in Denial, where she kind of explores this. It's the way in which we create social silences.
Yeah.
Around climate change in particular. And so there's this kind of phenomenon of climate silence where, as a topic, it doesn't come up very much in daily life. People's feelings about climate.
Oh, I didn't know that was a thing, because that's also, it's one thing to have a discussion with someone and nothing happening, but it's another thing to have I've been calling it taboo as well.
Yeah, it's definitely it.
It's not to be spoken about. And if you're speaking about it, you're also already breaching actually one social norm. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's exactly right. So I think this is really key as well. I mean, it's what we find is that this is behind a lot of how social change happens, right? Is that you start breaking those taboos. You start forcing them deliberately as a conscious effort to, around gender equality or around LGBT rights and so on. They've always had to kind of win this conversation and make a point of bringing it up, and so that it's not a dirty secret. It's not something that we feel uncomfortable about bringing to the discussion and having a proper chat about. Because unless we talk about it as a group, as a society, we can't have a politics around it. And if we can't have a politics around it, we can't build a vision for where we want to go. So that's true for within institutions as it is much for wider society. And so this notion that, if you're in a boardroom meeting or a committee meeting at university, and you're there to talk about the new curriculum, and maybe what you want to say is, I really think we should be putting climate change at the heart of our curriculum. But you feel very uncomfortable about saying that because you think, well, if I raise that, everybody will just maybe look at me like I'm off, or that I'm trying to inject, trying to disrupt the agenda or whatever. So I'm just going to not say it, or maybe I'll just say it very quickly at the end or something like that, right? And so again, it kind of builds in the inertia within what we're doing, because we're afraid of challenging the normal practices. So my advice, I guess, if there is any, is we just have to push through that. We just really have to kind of make a point of actually saying, no, I think this is so important right now. We need to talk about this. And then there's this interesting thing around pluralistic ignorance, right? Which is the notion that we don't know what other people are thinking, but we make
Yeah.
assumptions all the time. And we tend to assume the worst a lot of the time because we play it safe. And so, again, what we typically maybe find, I think, in my experience, is that when you say something along the lines of, well, I've been feeling very concerned about climate change and I feel that we aren't doing enough and that we should be doing more. The response is, oh, you feeling like that too? Oh, I've been feeling like that for ages as well. I
Yeah.
didn't realize other people were feeling like that. Um, and I think that doesn't, it's not surprising when you look at survey data because survey data shows that concern is very, very high. But when you ask people, how concerned do you think others are? They say, oh, I don't think other people are. I think it's only me or it's only a few of us. And the reason they're saying that is because when they look around them, they see everybody carrying on as normal. And so we're all kind of constantly lying to each other and therefore keeping us in this state of paralysis. And so again, one of the points of trying to do civil disobedience, as well as other kind of forms of speaking out, is to try and show very vividly to other people that they are not alone in thinking that this is a major problem that's not being addressed. And
Yeah.
that's a kind of a key message that we're trying to pop this bubble that we're all living within of this delusion
Yeah.
of the fact that we're alone in our concerns.
No, that's I'm starting to understand this. Probably going to say her name wrong. Catherine Hayhoe? Is that the way you know her? Yeah. So her TED Talk, I've been mentioning it a few times, and she said the most important thing you can do in the climate crisis, talk about it. So I'm starting to understand this on a different level now because, yeah, existential philosophers like, for instance, Heidegger also has these, that the things that we all share are precisely the things that we cannot really share, like my fear, my anxiety, my loneliness. I cannot literally share my feeling of lonely. Maybe you feel lonely sometimes, but how do we know that we feel the same? We cannot share. Wittgenstein has been also about this. We cannot, language doesn't serve us that, but you can have this feeling of sharedness. And I guess, that's what I'm getting so far from you. It's like, okay, let's say the prisoner returning from the surface to Plato's cave, they fail to convince the people there. But what if there's another one and another one? What is if there's a group on them? Maybe that would work.
But also this notion that maybe what they have to do is reassure them first, right?
Yeah.
Rather than just state facts or to kind of only talk to them on an intellectual basis. Maybe they have to really tap into talking about their own, like get people to express their fears. What is it that's scaring you about going outside? And how could we make it so that you're less scared about going on that journey or whatever, right? But I think maybe those fears are not irrational. Maybe there are genuine good reasons for those fears, but maybe they can also be overcome. I mean, just stepping back a little bit, I think another phrase that I find really helpful here is the notion of a fraud bubble. And this is coined by another psychoanalyst called Sally Weintraub. And she's saying that, climate change, we're all living in this fraud bubble in our societies. And that fraud is the notion that we can continue with business as usual, right? Or continue the kind of a growth-based economy, consumer economy that we have right now, right? And it's similar to other bubbles that there are in the financial market at times. So bubbles like, in Holland, the tulip bubble in the 1600s, or the spice bubble, or the housing bubble before the crisis. And right now we've kind of got this carbon bubble that's building, right? This notion that we keep investing in new fossil fuel developments, and that keeps bringing rewards so long as we keep investing in those developments. But as soon as we stop and we accept reality that we can't keep doing that, that bubble starts to lose value and maybe lose value very quickly. And so there's a kind of there's a logic that's to say keep inflating it, keep pushing into it, because that's how we keep the system going. Is the fact that this is based on this assumption that it's going to stay like that. And again, there's a danger here that we're trapped because we keep investing in the status quo, and that makes it even more fragile and more at odds with reality. And there's a bigger gap emerging between, we talk about an emissions gap or a production gap in, the UN reports to say, our climate policies are way off course so that we're not going to meet our targets, right? And that gap keeps getting bigger. And it gets to the point where to try and close that gap becomes actually quite destabilizing to society. And so then we're in a kind of a catch-22 where, we know we have to take action, but the longer we wait, the harder it gets.
And the more radical the actions will have to be as well to have the same
right.
effect.
And we've kind of got to that point now.
Yeah.
That's the reality. But we've got to find ways of trying to now deflate that bubble without it popping as best we can. And that takes courage, it takes leadership, and it's going to, but at the moment, we're not seeing that because we're not even really able to address it and point it out that that's what's happening.
Well, great. So, I had a lot of insights now in what concerned people in general can do, but also especially scientists, which is, speak about it, speak to each other, but also organize. So if anyone is listening to this who's working at an academic institution in any position of power, maybe because you kind of have two identities, right? Your natural scientist identity. What are the top 3 actions that any university or academic institution could take to do their part in the climate crisis? And the other thing is maybe what are the top 3 things that they could do to support this movement, this climate movement as a social movement?
I start to see these things converging. I try and bring them together. I think what we need is more activists in the academy. And I think a colleague of mine uses a phrase, we need to go from publications to public actions. And I think, what does that mean? What does that look like? And so I think the first question that we have to grapple with as academics is, what is the purpose of a university in a time of climate emergency? The timescales that we're talking about are not aligned to the timescales of our research agendas, right? Normally, which are to kind of, produce research that gets published and then maybe in a few decades might lead to something, right? Or likewise, our teaching, we teach young people in the hope that their ideas will influence how they then can go and work or build new institutions. We don't have time for a lot of that, right?
Yeah.
So we have to find ways of taking action now, and what are the kind of the levers that we can pull now, and that I think needs a shift in our thinking, that rather than purely taking kind of I guess what I'm saying is that I think we need to have much more active research where we are out there trying to make changes in the world and then trying to reflect on how we're going about doing that. I think that's the kind of the function that universities could play, and that actually the skills that we need to be teaching students right now are skills in how to create system transformation, how to challenge existing power hierarchies, how to challenge these logics that maintain the status quo. Those are uncomfortable things to be bringing into the classroom. I don't think it's okay at this point to simply stand back and give a lecture saying, this is the climate crisis, go away, do something about it. I think we have to take a much more active role in saying, no, like, we're going to stand next to you as young people coming through our institution and help you build the world that you want to see, and equip you with the skills that you need to build that world. And a lot of those skills are going to be, I think, skills in how to campaign, how to build public pressure to put on to decision makers. And maybe that should start within our own institutions. Can we work with students to push for changes that they want to see in the university and help them learn how to do that in their local communities, perhaps potentially in the local cities that we're situated in? What would that look like? And I've worked on a really interesting project for a while in colleges in the UK where we were, doing something a bit like that, where we were teaching 16 to 18-year-olds how to run a political campaign or a social change that, the students worked on what it is they wanted to see and how, and then we kind of supported them to think about how to develop action plans in order to achieve it. And, the students learned through that how to be a democratically engaged citizen. They learned what it was to have collective agency, how to organize and identify pressure points and so on, right?
Yeah.
And they built the skills that they needed in order to have persuasive conversations or in order to bring other people on board and to build a movement.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I liked about the article from publications to public actions. I'll put a link as well, where you say, well, now this is about climate, but actually if you start implementing these changes and you teach them those skills, there's lots of other crises as well. And there's lots of other social issues with diversity and inequality and all that stuff that it will be helpful as well.
Absolutely. I mean, from my point of view, most of these crises all share kind of common roots.
Right, exactly. Climate justice, right?
But I think from that perspective, these skills, like you say, they're transferable, they're intersectional, and so that's one thing. I think within universities. I do think we need scientists to be much more outspoken, and I think maybe to as part of that to actually speak more emotionally as well. I think, as I was trying to say, information on its own doesn't lead to action necessarily. It can just bounce off people, or we know that, right? We need to look at the kind of skills of rhetoric. I think, that how we tell narratives, how we tell stories, that we can put meaning around what we know. And I think for me, that kind of means recognizing that I'm not simply a scientist or a researcher. I'm also a scholar who exists within an academic community and has responsibilities to the students and other members of the academic community. What does it look like to act on those duties and those responsibilities? I'm also a citizen. I'm also a member of my community in Cardiff, where I live. What kind of responsibilities does that mean that I have as well? And so this is where I think, again, thinking about it doesn't make sense to me, this idea that scientists should somehow remain apart from society or pretend as though we're completely neutral about what's happening in order to kind of maintain a kind of a false appearance of objectivity. I think it's much more honest and needed at this time that instead we're explicit about our values and what it is that we think is important, and so that our audience can judge us based on that. They can make sense of what we're telling them with respect to the values that we say we hold, and that's, I don't think that's anything wrong with that. I mean, we go to our doctors expecting them to want to make us healthy, right? We go to sustainability scientists because we know that they want to try and protect our planet and make sure it's habitable and healthy.
Yeah, and I mean the medical profession is based on the value of promoting health, and those are all values as well, right?
Exactly. So I think we really need to kind of change our thinking quite rapidly on those areas. And then finally, like, as right now, I think, as you were saying, Mario, we are seeing governments clamping down on protest and human rights. I think it's really important that academics are out there speaking out against that.
If I'm arrested, if I'm a scientist at a protest and I'm mistreated by the police, is my institution going to be on my side, or is it going to be on the government side?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I would really hope they'd be on your side. Academic freedom and everything, but also, we've got trade unions that should be representing us and defending our rights there and things. But I think particularly we are going to we know I think now that governments won't act without social pressure. So those groups out there in society that are trying to create that social pressure are incredibly valuable to all of our futures, our sakes, right? So if governments are clamping down and repressing them, then we lose our hope we're losing those opportunities to actually get ourselves out of this mess. And it could lead us into, very bad places as well, because obviously, the more disrupted climate change gets, the more authoritarian governments might become in response to that. And I think in those circumstances, we're going to see, worse outcomes in terms of the impacts, right? Because, in order to protect the people who are most marginalized in societies, we need to have open democracies that value human rights. And again, people are going to need to be able to protest in order to protect those. So at this time, I think it's really important that all of us are defending protesters and their rights. And I think the more that academics speak out about that, the better.
Yeah, and that's why I think that maybe one of the most important professions right now is the lawyer, because they're doing great work right now, a lot of them. And I think, actually, a lot of my hope is there as well. I'm not a law expert. I think you're not either, but I think I want to speak to some of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too. I mean, I think there's hope in lots of places. There's lots of people waking up and trying to take action where they can and finding communities and using the skills and the knowledge that they have in order to push for change, right? And there's so many levers that we have to pull, and we have to pull them all together. So yeah, I think the law is really key there, like you say. I mean, we've just had a really interesting development in the UK where we've had, over 100 senior lawyers now announce that they will refuse to prosecute peaceful climate protesters.
Oh, that's so inspiring. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very inspiring. I mean, for me, it's incredibly heartening, but, that's a real... that's a really brave thing for them to do. It kind of challenges the norms within their institutions. Potentially puts them in breach of their professional ethics, ethics which I think need to be challenged if that's what they're doing. But it tells us, I think, the severity of the moment that we're in. That lawyers who understand what's going on are willing to take those kind of actions, right? Similarly, doctors I've seen organizing as well to protect public health. And they're organizing in lots of different ways. Some of them are looking at how do they decarbonize their hospitals and their the supply chains and so on. But others are looking at how to put pressure on governments in order to invest in infrastructure that will decarbonize societies, knowing that climate change is the greatest health threat of the century. So whichever sector or discipline that you're in, there is a way to be active on these issues. And I think that's true very much of the university community, right? There's no such thing as saying, oh, well, my department or my discipline doesn't relate to climate change, because climate change affects everything and everything impacts on the climate. So whether or not you're studying humanities or you're studying medicine or you're studying law, there is something you should be learning right now about what it is to take action on the climate change.
Thank you so much. I just want to end with the most concrete question that I can think of. So if people really want to get into action, if they want to propose something to their department, or if university leaders want to do something, it must be very concrete. I already mentioned, switching to a standard vegetarian diet. What are the other top 3 things that they can do right now and that would be effective?
Within a university setting?
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of the easy things to say, like I think universities should stop taking any sponsorship from fossil fuel companies, right? I don't think they should take any research funding from them. They should refuse to collaborate with them, right? There's a group called Fossil Free Research that are really trying to push that now, and we've seen some universities who've said that they will cut ties in that way. So that would be a thing that I think universities should really consider doing instantaneously. Like you say, there's things that we can do on campus that would really set a good example, like making sure that none of our canteens or outlets, that they switch to a more plant-based menu. We've seen universities in the UK now really going down that route. And I think, again, they're setting an example. And that's normally done, because of students pushing for it and demanding those kind of changes. So it's taken activism to accomplish those things, but then they become a signal to the rest of society. So I think there's ways in which we can lead by example and then try and use those examples to put pressure on other parts of the system, right? So once you've done it in your university, can you then go and pressure your local council to do the same? Can you, work with local schools in the area to do the same? Can you work with the local hospital to do the same? So once we get that ball rolling, we can then try and build from that example. I think one of the most important things, I think, is to look at curriculum reform. I think we really desperately need to rewrite curricula around what it would be to build a sustainable society. That's something, again, at least in the UK, and I've seen that students are really demanding. I've seen they're trying to push for a bill to go through Parliament in the UK at the moment, written by school students, asking for there to be climate emergency materials in every single subject that they learn. And I think universities should be doing the same thing. And potentially, a course that all students take, so that they've got a common framework, a common understanding, a common way of talking together that's very interdisciplinary about the kind of things that we have to do. Because if we don't have that at universities, then how is that going to get into the rest of society? And I think that's something that I would really, really like to see more. One of the reasons that I think scientists should consider taking action, or any scientist takes action, is because of the role that universities play and the social conditions that allow those universities to function. Universities depend on stable societies. They depend on stable environmental conditions that underpin those societies. And it's exactly those conditions that are being disrupted by climate change. And we know that, if we see continue as we are to the end of the century, that those conditions won't exist anymore in many parts of the world. And we could well see, institutions like ours crumbling because of that. So if we are there really as academics, scholars, trying to maintain our role as institutions that build and maintain and hand over knowledge from generation to generation, then in order to continue playing that function, we have to protect the social and environmental conditions that enable universities to exist in order to do that. So I think all of us as academics can see that we have something at stake here. We've all spent our lives, researching very particular topics because we value them and we want to see that knowledge handed down and maintained. And yet there won't be someone to hand it down to if we don't really look after the conditions that we are in. And so, I think there's kind of, just to put that in a catchphrase, there's no professorships on a dead planet. Why are we doing this if not to look after the knowledge that we're producing? And that means looking after and making sure that we live in a sustainable society. So if none of the other things that we said persuaded you to take action, then maybe that one will.
Well, thank you so much. It has been very inspiring and enlightening to speak to you.
Thank you, Mario. It's been fun.
And thank you for listening. Check out the show notes for more information on Aaron and links to his articles and to Scientist Rebellion website. And go to livefromplatoscave.com for other episodes. In case you're interested, I recently did an interview with Sabine Winters for her podcast Scientific Imagination. It's on imagining the climate crisis. So you can find the link in the description as well. I hope to see you again next time.